Welcome, friends, to another story that begins with silence, not the dramatic crash of a market or the noise of political grandstanding, but the kind of silence that comes after the machines stop humming, the lights dim, and a factory floor stands still. This time, that silence belongs to Ingersoll, Ontario, once the proud symbol of Canada's electric vehicle revolution, now the stage for a quiet reckoning. Not long ago, this small industrial town was buzzing with ambition. Politicians stood shoulder to shoulder with executives, cutting ribbons and declaring a new chapter for Canada's clean energy future. Billions in investment poured into the Kami Ingersoll plant, home to General Motors' Bright Drop electric vans, sleek, efficient, and branded as the future of sustainable logistics. It was more than a factory. It was a promise, a symbol that Canada would not just join, but lead the next industrial revolution. But then, one morning, the announcement came. Production halted, workers sent home, the hum stopped, and the promise, that bold, shining pledge, suddenly flickered. GM's Bright Drop line, once hailed as a triumph of innovation, became another casualty in the increasingly turbulent landscape of North American manufacturing. Now, on the surface, the cause seemed straightforward. Cost pressures, falling demand, strategic realignment, but look closer, and the story grows more complicated. The trouble began not in Ontario, but south of the border in Washington. The spark was political and the fire was economic. When the Trump administration imposed a 25% tariff on vehicles built in Canada, the math changed overnight. You see, modern auto manufacturing isn't confined by borders. A single electric van might cross the US-Canada border several times before completion. Batteries from Quebec, aluminum from Michigan, software from Ontario, and assembly in Ingersoll. Tariffs didn't just make cars more expensive. They shattered that seamless rhythm. Costs surged, parts piled up, and production timelines began to stretch like an overworked conveyor belt. General Motors, faced with ballooning expenses over $1 billion in tariff-related losses in just one quarter, had to choose where to cut. And like so many times before, the knife fell where the numbers were smallest, but the impact most human. Hundreds of workers in Ingersoll found themselves suspended between paychecks and promises. Yet what followed wasn't the usual storm of outrage and despair. Across Ontario, there was no panic, no televised protests. Instead, there was something subtler and perhaps more telling, a calm recalibration. Local unions negotiated retraining programs. Suppliers adjusted contracts. Municipalities repurposed funding to support displaced workers. The machinery of response turned quietly, efficiently, almost as if it had been rehearsed. And that's the point it had been. Canada, unlike its southern neighbor, had spent years building what economists now call a shock absorber economy. It didn't make headlines because it wasn't flashy. No slogans, no trade wars, no America first. Instead, it was policy, boring, steady, incremental policy that quietly built resilience into the nation's industrial core. So when Washington swung the tariff hammer, Canada didn't retaliate with noise. It responded with calculation. Ottawa rolled out relief funds within weeks, tax credits, supply chain grants, stabilization programs. It's easy to miss how radical that is. In an age when so many governments react to crises with chaos, Canada's approach was almost surgical. That composure made all the difference. While the U.S. market spiraled into uncertainty, Ontario's economy absorbed the shock and kept moving. Workers were redeployed, not discarded. Contracts were restructured, not abandoned. And behind it all, there was a sense, faint but growing, that this was more than just economic management. It was an expression of national character. Because you see, what unfolded in Ontario wasn't just an industrial adjustment, it was a cultural statement that stability matters more than spectacle, that leadership isn't about domination, but coordination. And in the midst of global disruption, that quiet steadiness began to look less like passivity and more like power. The question now isn't whether Canada can recover, it already has. The question is whether the United States, trapped in its cycle of tariff wars and political theater, can recognize what its neighbor just demonstrated, that resilience isn't built on slogans, but on systems, and that sometimes the silence after the shutdown isn't an ending, it's the sound of something else beginning. Let me tell you what that means. When GM halted production, it wasn't just workers who faced uncertainty. Suppliers across Ontario, from metal fabricators in Brantford to software developers in Kitchener, all braced for impact. But the shockwave never quite landed. Why? Because the foundation was ready. Canada's manufacturing ecosystem had been quietly rewired over the past decade to withstand disruption. It was no accident. It was architecture. Ottawa had built safety nets designed for exactly this moment. Within days, the federal government activated a $5 billion strategic response fund for tariff-affected industries. Regional stabilization programs doubled their budgets, ensuring local economies didn't freeze under pressure. Retraining initiatives kicked in, guiding thousands of workers into EV battery research, logistics, and renewable energy sectors. These were not patches, they were pressure valves, and they worked. While in the U.S., mass layoffs spread like wildfire through electric and hybrid divisions, Canada's job market barely flinched. Unemployment in manufacturing hovered near pre-shutdown levels, and new contracts emerged from the ashes, smaller, leaner, but smarter. It was as if the entire system had learned how to bend without breaking. But resilience, friends, isn't built on numbers alone. It's also built on trust. Workers trusted that the government would intervene, and the government trusted that industry would adapt. That mutual faith, that rare cooperation between public and private sectors, gave Canada an advantage that economists often underestimate: social cohesion. You can't quantify it easily, but when it exists, it's powerful. It shortens the distance between crisis and recovery. Now let's step back and see what made this so different from the American approach. South of the border, Washington answered crisis with confrontation. Tariffs meant to protect domestic jobs instead created instability that rippled through entire industries. Costs rose, exports fell, and even U.S.-based automakers struggled to plan beyond a single fiscal quarter. Political theater replaced economic strategy. Canada took another path, slower, steadier, less dramatic. While the U.S. was busy erecting walls, Canada was building bridges, not just metaphorically, but literally. Partnerships with South Korea, Japan, and the European Union expanded access to raw materials and alternative markets. When the U.S. supply chain stumbled, Canada's diversified routes kept goods flowing. When the dollar fluctuated, its policy buffers absorbed the hit. It's worth remembering Canada faces harsher natural limits than most industrial nations. Its geography is vast, its winters unforgiving, its population spread thin, yet somehow those very limitations became strengths. The coal that drained EV batteries inspired a wave of technological innovation. Startups emerged to tackle one of electric transport's most stubborn problems: how to make batteries thrive in sub-zero temperatures. University labs in Ontario began testing new lithium iron phosphate compositions that could sustain power in 20 degrees Celsius conditions. Meanwhile, companies like Canada Post and Purolator experimented with hybrid fleets, blending hydrogen and electric technologies to keep deliveries on time through snow and ice. The crisis, instead of stopping progress, accelerated invention. And this is where Canada's story turns philosophical, because resilience isn't just about surviving shocks, it's about transforming them into catalysts. Every policy that stabilized Ontario's EV sector after the bright drop pause was rooted in a larger idea that economic security and environmental progress are not opposing forces, but complementary ones. Contrast that with Washington's contradictions: preaching green growth while subsidizing oil, calling for innovation while waging tariff wars that stifle it. Canada's approach, though smaller in scale, proved more coherent. Its message to industry was clear: we'll support you through transition, not abandon you to competition. That clarity created confidence, and confidence in economics is a currency as valuable as capital. So when the bright drop assembly lines fell silent, and the silence wasn't despair, it was breathing room, a pause before a pivot. And pivot Canada did. Suppliers who once relied on U.S. imports began sourcing locally. Regions that depended on single employers diversified their industrial base. In short, the country used crisis as a tool for recalibration. You see, friends, this is not just about tariffs, cars, or trade. It's about a philosophy of governance, the belief that markets alone can't handle volatility, that nations need systems of cooperation and foresight. And in that sense, Canada has quietly become a case study in what I'd call pragmatic resilience. It doesn't seek glory, it seeks balance. The result: a nation that absorbs shocks instead of amplifying them, a workforce that sees adaptation not as defeat but as continuity, and a government that treats economic planning not as interference but as insurance. Let's pick up where we left off, in that delicate moment when adaptation becomes transformation. By now, we've seen how Canada managed to steady itself while the U.S. stumbled. But what came next went beyond resilience. It was reinvention, quiet, methodical, and deeply strategic. When GM paused production at Ingersoll, many assumed it marked the end of Canada's electric dream. Yet, what unfolded instead was a redistribution of momentum. The bright drop shutdown exposed how fragile cross-border dependency had become, and that realization sparked something deeper: a collective decision to reclaim control. You see, Canada had long lived in the shadow of its southern neighbor, an economy deeply intertwined with American demand, pricing, and policy. For decades, integration was the word that defined success. But tariffs changed the grammar of trade. Suddenly, integration began to look like vulnerability. The very system that once guaranteed growth now risked collapse with a single stroke of an executive pen in Washington. And so Canada did something unusual for a modern capitalist economy. It turned inward, not in isolation, but in strategy. It began building what policymakers called a made in Canada EV ecosystem, a self-contained industrial chain stretching from mining to manufacturing, designed to insulate the nation from foreign turbulence. In the mineral-rich North, new investment flowed into nickel and lithium extraction materials critical for battery production. But this time, those resources didn't leave the country. They were refined, processed, and repurposed domestically. From Sudbury's mines to Quebec's cathode plants, Canada began weaving together an industrial web it could finally call its own. And here's the irony. What began as a reaction to American protectionism evolved into a blueprint for sovereignty. Public investment surged not as stimulus, but as strategy. Over $52 billion in incentives were deployed between 2020 and 2024, the highest share of public support for EV manufacturing in the G7 relative to GDP. Private capital followed, totaling another $46 billion. Together they created a network of innovation, a manufacturing ecosystem that no longer needed permission from Washington to grow. Meanwhile, south of the border, GM and other automakers were still battling cost inflation and political uncertainty. While American policymakers debated the next tariff or subsidy, Canada quietly executed a plan stabilizing energy costs, standardizing green certifications, and streamlining approvals for industrial zones. Bureaucracy, often seen as the enemy of progress, was turned into its ally. Predictability became the new competitive edge. Let me tell you why that matters. In the modern economy, volatility is poison. Markets thrive not only on profit, but on trust. The trust that tomorrow's rules will look like today's. Canada's consistency, its refusal to chase the political mood of the moment, became a selling point. International investors took note. Economists began calling Ontario North America's stability zone, a label that would have seemed laughable 20 years ago when the region was struggling with plant closures and NAFTA shocks. Now, that stability started attracting giants. Volkswagen broke ground in St. Thomas. Stellantis and LG Energy Solutions launched their massive Windsor battery plant. These weren't just factories. They were symbols of confidence, evidence that Canada's cautious model could in fact outperform America's boom and bust cycle. What's remarkable is how all this unfolded without the fanfare of industrial revolutions or great resets. No slogans, no shouting, just quiet planning, coordination, and trust. It's an almost un-American approach, not built on confrontation, but on continuity. Still, let's be clear. This isn't a fairy tale. Challenges remain. Canada's domestic market is small, and its dependence on exports can't disappear overnight. But the direction of travel has changed. For the first time in decades, Ottawa's industrial policy isn't reactive. It's generational. It's thinking about where the country will be 50 years from now, not just after the next election. And in that long horizon, we glimpse something profound, a philosophical divergence in how two nations understand power. Washington still wields it through dominance, through threats, tariffs, and short-term leverage. Ottawa wields it through endurance, through the slow, deliberate act of building capacity and cooperation. One approach extracts, the other cultivates. The difference shows in the United States, protectionism has bred paralysis. Supply chains that were once global are now fragmented. Political instability turns economic planning into a guessing game. Canada, meanwhile, has discovered a quieter kind of sovereignty, not shouting about greatness, but demonstrating competence, not claiming exceptionalism, but proving adaptability. For over a century, the story of this continent was simple. The United States built and everyone else supplied. Washington designed the rules, set the pace, and exported its crises northward and southward whenever it pleased. But the Bright Drop shutdown, small as it may seem, exposed a deeper fracture that the old hierarchy no longer guarantees stability. And in that space, Canada began writing its own story. Let's start with what changed on the ground. Across Ontario and Quebec, the EV ecosystem matured from an experiment into infrastructure, mining, refining, assembly, logistics, all connected through policy coherence and local expertise. That coherence is power, because while the U.S. shuffles between stimulus bills and partisan reversals, Canada's direction remains consistent. It doesn't need to reinvent itself every 4 years. It plans, it adjusts, it endures. This endurance is reshaping global trade too. You see, when Washington pushed protectionism, Ottawa pivoted eastward. Trade with the European Union deepened under green tech agreements. Battery materials from Quebec now flow to German automakers. Hydrogen partnerships with South Korea and Japan grew. Even Australia entered joint projects on critical minerals. The world, in short, started looking at Canada not as an appendage of the U.S., but as an independent anchor in the global green economy. And that's the paradox. While the U.S. wraps itself in slogans of dominance, Canada is quietly becoming indispensable. Investors understand it, supply chains reflect it. The map of manufacturing power is shifting away from Detroit and toward Windsor, away from Texas and toward Quebec, where the combination of cheap, clean energy and stable governance attracts long-term capital. The future of North American industry may not wear stars and stripes, but maple leaves. Let me tell you, this moment holds a lesson larger than economics. It shows how empires fade not with a dramatic collapse, but through quiet displacement. While Washington argues over tariffs, debt ceilings, and slogans, its neighbors learn to function without it. Canada's example reveals what happens when a smaller power takes the long view, how patience, planning, and social trust can achieve what brute economic force no longer can. And it's not just industry that's changing. This new model of governance, steady, cooperative, deliberate, is reshaping identity. Workers who once feared globalization now see opportunity in transition. Communities that once relied on a single automaker now build networks of smaller, specialized firms. The fear of losing the future is giving way to the confidence of designing it. Meanwhile, the U.S. continues to pay the price of contradiction. It talks about innovation while punishing cooperation. It claims to defend workers while undermining their stability. It wages economic wars on its allies in the name of protecting its own jobs, and in doing so accelerates their independence. It's the oldest irony of empire. The harder it clings, the faster it loses its grip. Every shutdown, every recalibration, every measured policy has added weight to a simple truth. The center of industrial gravity in North America is shifting northward. So what does this mean for the future? It means that in the coming decade, that Canada's model, not America's, may define how advanced economies navigate the green transition. It means stability will outlast spectacle. Cooperation will outcompete confrontation. And endurance, not dominance, will decide Who leads in the age of clean technology? And here's the final irony, friends. This transformation didn't come with a revolution, but with restraint. No banners, no grand declarations, just the steady hum of factories that learned to pause, adapt, and restart stronger. The empire fades not with a bang, but with a whisper. And in that whisper, you can hear the rhythm of a new world being built. So share this, talk about it, and face the truth together. The future isn't coming from the loudest voice in the room. It's coming from the one that listens, plans, and builds even when no one's watching.